welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am reading through some of America's earliest best-selling novels, as reported in the 1890s literary magazine The Bookman. Today's book is Hugh Wynne, or by its full title, Hugh Wynne, Free Quaker, sometime Brevet Lieutenant Colonel on the staff of His Excellency General Washington. I thought the super long full title of Houseboat on the Styx was a joke, because that book is a comedy, but it seems like that might actually just be a thing of this era. Hugh Wynne was written by Silas Weir Mitchell, who was a well-known physician before he was an author. His medical career included everything from studying the effects of rattlesnake venom to being credited with coining the term phantom limb syndrome as part of his work during the Civil War, to pioneering the rest cure, which was mostly used on hysterical women and involved being isolated, confined to bed, not even allowed to read or speak to family, sometimes even roll over by yourself while being fed obscene quantities of milk and electroshocked for like 2 straight months. The treatment was for 2 straight months. They weren't being shocked for literally that entire time. Phrasing. Lots of people praised him for this method. However, several patients, or perhaps victims, of it spoke out against it quite aggressively, saying that if anything, it made things worse, which, yeah, it doesn't sound great. Hugh Wynne is another historical, even when it was written, novel. It takes place before and during the American Revolutionary War, and it's written in the style of an autobiography. So Hugh, the main character, is writing down his own memoir sometime in his own future, and directly addressing the audience, pondering retrospectively, sometimes giving information out of order. What's especially interesting to me is that there's this whole introductory page where Hugh, the author, talks about his difficulties in writing this memoir, specifically his struggles with first person, all to justify and explain why he's including excerpts from the journal of his very close but now dead dear friend Jack Warder, which I feel like he could have just done. We didn't need a whole page of excuses. You can quote your friend. That wouldn't be weird. But I find it very fascinating and kind of charming that this fictional main character is given such a thought-out perspective on the process of writing his own memoir. It's also hilariously unnecessary. Speaking of unnecessary, a whole page of Hugh talking about why he wants to talk about his childhood before he actually gets around to talking about his childhood, at which point we go all the way back to Pennsylvania, 1753, the year of his birth. Hugh was born to a hardcore Quaker father. Now, I wasn't all that familiar with Quakers outside of being a brand of oats, and most of my familiarity at this point is from this book, which, while based on reality, is fictional and written about a very specific portion of this community living in a very particular time. Essentially, when I say Quaker in this episode, I'm talking about the Quakers present in this novel, not trying to discuss an entire religious community. And that's a distinction I want to make, especially because I get a little critical later, and even then, not at the whole community in the book, even mostly just one character who is being presented as extreme. I'm getting ahead of myself. Quakers, or the Religious Society of Friends, are a sort of Christian subgroup first appearing mid-17th century. Many came to America from Europe, specifically a lot to Pennsylvania, where we spend a majority of this book. They have pretty strict, very plain styles of dress and furnishing of one's house, a deep concern with avoiding vanity, and a heavy focus on obedience and non-resistance. Often that's supposed to mean non-violence. They also say thee and thou, even though that was very out of date by this time, and refer to other Quakers as friends with a capital F. So the main ideals that Hugh's father lives by are basically no fun, no fighting, nothing fancy, and no French. But I don't think that's a standard Quaker thing. That's more of a Hugh's dad thing, which is concerning because his wife is French. Her name is Marie, but he doesn't like that name, so he only ever calls her wife and forbids her from ever speaking her native language because, quote, he hated all French things and declared the language did not ring true, end quote. Marie is technically Quaker also, but she's a lot more lenient, meaning that she's actually nice and sweet and funny, and despite her husband's best efforts, she does teach Hugh to speak French in secret. But we don't just stop at going all the way back to Hugh's birth, we go back even further, to Hugh's grandfather, the first in the family line to turn Quaker. Back in Wales, mid-1600s, Grandpappy had a grand estate, but got thrown in prison for refusing to pay religious tithes, because Quaker, so he gave his lands away to a younger brother and caught a ship to the colonies. Despite losing this estate, Hugh's family do quite well in America, and by the time Hugh's father is up and around, they have amassed, among other things, some tobacco plantations. Quote, "I may add that the possession of many slaves gave them the feeling of authority and position which the colonial was apt to lose in the presence of his English rulers." So that's great. Most of the slaves and all of the plantation land is in Maryland, not Pennsylvania, so that's all, just off-screen, don't worry about it. This book isn't as constant as, Captain Horn was, but it does have some pretty notable, gross, old-timey racism throughout. Also, fun fact, Grandpappy married his distant cousin, but she died before they had kids, so he married his dead cousin wife's sister. Lovely man. I can see where Daddy gets it from. Now, most of that, I promise, will be somewhat meaningful. This next part will not. I just find it fascinating. So, in Hugh's childhood home, the great room, where their dining table is, has a 2-inch layer of white sand covering the entire floor, in which his mom has carefully traced a pattern of zigzag lines. She would like to do flower designs, but Dad thinks that would be too vain. This sand flooring, including with decorative designs, is something I found some reference to, especially in colonial American history. People seem to think it was a cleanliness thing, like it'd help catch mud and dirt, and every so often you could sweep it all out and replace it. It's unclear, I think, what sort of floor Hugh's house has under the sand. I would assume unfinished wood, based on how sand floors were being discussed in other sources. I don't know enough about cleaning rough wood floors to know if hauling loads of sand in and out of your house would be easier than just sweeping and scrubbing them sometimes. But anyways, 2 inches deep? That seems like a lot. I don't know if that part's legitimate. Hugh does say a different part of the house has a thinly sanded floor, so either his definition of thin is quite different than mine, or maybe the great room has a thicker layer for decor, I guess. Anyway, we hear a bit about Hugh's time at school. This is the time when he starts getting close to Jack Warder, whose journal we will get some excerpts from later. Their teacher is known to rarely, quote, use the birch, end quote, to beat the children. He prefers psychological punishment through public humiliation. Like, when Hugh is late to school once, when he's about 12, and so some older boys are sent to find him. They tie a lantern around his neck and ring a bell while they make him march back to school so people can point and laugh at him. Shame, shame, shame. There's a girl at the school who starts crying instead of laughing because she feels bad for him. And the teacher's response to this is to make her take off her stays, which are similar to a corset, although hers are described as being worn outside the gown, which... these are generally an undergarment. I don't know if this is because they're a child's, or because the author didn't know enough about women's underwear, or if I'm just wrong. Regardless, they're thick and sturdy enough to interfere with the birch whipping this teacher then gives her for daring to feel bad for a classmate. Later, Hugh writes that the teacher is a cruel beast on the school wall in chalk, and the next day the teacher offers £1 to anyone who can point out the vandalizer. So Hugh confesses and asks for his £1. Quote, "I will give thee a pounding," he roared, and gave me a beating so terrible and cruel that at last the girls cried aloud, and he let me drop on the floor, sore and angry. End quote. Let us remember that this is the teacher known for not making liberal use of physical punishment. Hugh's dad then comes to the school and threatens to birch whip the teacher if he doesn't keep his promise to pay, so he pays, and then Hugh's dad keeps the money because he's mad at Hugh and proceeds to be irritable with him for days because his 12-year-old son caused the situation that made he, the father, tempted to act violently against his Quakery values. 10 out of 10 great parenting. As Hugh gets a little older, he spends a decent amount of time at his Aunt Gaynor's. She's Dad's older sister and his opposite in pretty much every way. She has a fancy-ass house, plays cards all the time, and is very proud of her aristocratic Welsh lineage. 0% Quaker and unmarried, so Hugh is actually her heir. She's also a very successful businesswoman in the same sort of trade business as Hugh's dad, and is not afraid to march through the muddy, rougher parts of town armed with a whip, intimidating people into giving her good bargains. She gives Hugh lots of books and introduces him to people of high society who seem to do nothing but play cards and get drunk. His father reluctantly lets him spend time with her despite her being a bad influence because she's his only other family. Those vizard masks come up again. I talked about them in The Choir Invisible, but they're discussed in a little more detail here. Slightly. A vizard was a type of mask worn to protect a woman's skin from the sun, made of fabric and covering all of the face except the eyes, generally held in place by a metal bead gripped between the teeth. In this book, there is a distinction made between a vizard and a riding mask, which there isn't enough detail given to actually differentiate between them here, and a loo mask, which has a chin curtain, so presumably an upper face mask that fastens on with loose fabric to shield the rest of the face, I guess. At least in this book, they come in a variety of colors, so I don't have to imagine them all as the deeply unsettling solid black. I am really curious where these 1890s writers were getting their information on historical fashions, and if vizards were really as common as they're being made out to be. As Hugh grows into adolescence, political tensions are rising around him, and people around town are starting to divide on whether they are upset with English rule or supportive. Aunt Gaynor is firmly on the side of screw the king. Hugh's father follows the agreed-on beliefs of the local Quaker squad. This is that whole non-resistance thing, that whoever rules over them is there because God said so keep your head down and deal with it. Can't help but notice that Hugh's granddad was a good Quaker because he refused to pay tithes that he thought were unjust, so he came to America to evade that control, and that was fine. But people upset about British taxes now, they just need to shut up and obey the government. And speaking of questionable Quakerly opinions, Hugh's mom makes a comment that they can't trust one of their slaves to deliver something because, quote, thy father had him whipped at the jail yesterday and he is sulky, end quote. Funny how the whole no fighting, no war, no resistance Quaker thing isn't called no violence, leaving a loophole through which you can still whip your children and enslaved servants. And if they resist, now that's the true sin. In between his time at school and then working as a clerk for his father, Hugh and his bestie Jack do apprentice briefly as blacksmiths, and they both get really buff, which Hugh thinks that Jack especially needed. He's always been the more timid, scrawny, thoughtful one. Jack gets called the girl boy throughout the entirety of this book, just because he's blonde and prone to blushing, but now he's also a beefcake, though Hugh still describes him as being, quote, quite too pretty, end quote. Then, as Hugh ages up into his 20s, he starts working for his dad. He has a lot of leisure time and spends most of it hanging out at his aunt's, where, remember, she hosts a lot of social events full of bad influences. And these new friends of Hugh's get him really into gambling and hard drinking. And even those are, quote, some of his most reputable pursuits, end quote. He falls out with Jack in this period, since he isn't into that scene, though Jack notes in one of his journal excerpts that this wasn't because of some stronger moral backbone, but just innate disinterest and mostly physical weakness, because unlike Hugh, Jack couldn't go binge drinking and then wake up chipper hungry and headache-free at 5 a.m. the next morning, so it just wasn't as worth it. Aunt Gaynor suggests that his dad should retire since he has plenty of money, and she says that the only reason he's still in the trade business is because he likes the game, the risk, and is that not in its own way a form of gambling? Dad does not react well to this suggestion, especially since she's talking, quote, such wicked nonsense before this boy. He has begun to have opinions of his own as to taxes and concerning the plain duty of non-resistance, as if an idle dog like him had any right to have an opinion at all, end quote. Ah, yes, it's not the gambling and the drinking that's the big problem, it's that he has opinions about taxes. After this fight, Hugh goes floating down the river in a boat and reflects, quote, the mood of distressful self-accusation was on me. I had one of those minutes of wishing to die which come even to the wholesome young. I felt as the youthful do sometimes feel, as if I were old and the ending of things were near. It was but a mood, but it led to serious thought, end quote. This leads into, quote, that this proud and steadfast man, so looked up to by everyone, should have been humiliated by a woman, seemed to me intolerable. This was the chief outcome of my reflections, end quote. That is your chief outcome, sir? Not, maybe I shouldn't have sassed my dad, or maybe he's right about me being an idle party boy, or even maybe my dad is a hypocritical asshole for trying to beat me in a blind rage despite preaching nonviolence. No, the problem is that a woman may have bruised his ego. Shortly thereafter, Hugh is out socializing with the guys, and he meets a cousin of his, Arthur Wynne, from a branch of the family that stayed in Europe. Arthur is the grandson of one of Hugh's great uncles, his grandfather's youngest brother, who ended up with the family estate in Wales when Grandad left. Arthur is 10 years older, early 30s. He's a captain, a military man. He's very well dressed and handsome. Hugh has every intention of behaving himself that night, but is too busy chatting with his new cousin to realize how much he's drinking, and then he does try to leave, but for some reason the door to go downstairs is locked. He doesn't seem to find this all that concerning, and it never really gets addressed. So if he can't leave, might as well gamble. So he plays some dice and loses £100, which I wasn't thinking of being that big a deal, but then I checked the present day value and it came out as potentially over 20,000 modern day pounds. But also, apparently his mother has some pearls just lying around that she thinks are worth enough to cover the debt. Pearls can be that pricey, probably especially back then. Worth conversion is complicated, but that's just startlingly expensive. She doesn't even wear them, but I'm surprised Mr. No Vanity even allows those in the house. Anyways, Hugh has a gambling problem. Then a woman's voice calls from outside the door, which is very unusual, and Arthur makes a bet that whoever she is, she'll be pretty, and when someone finally finds the key to the damn door and opens it, Hugh's mother steps in, having come to find him. Arthur declares that while she's a bit old, he has won that bet, and tipsily grabs her by the waist. So Hugh punches him across a table and onto the floor. And the following day, Aunt Gaynor is worried that he's going to have to duel Arthur over the insult of having struck him, and for some reason through that whole interaction, Hugh is just staring at and thinking about her nose, and its large proportional size to the rest of her face, and even acknowledges in text that it's a weird thing to be thinking about in that moment. I don't know why this was written in. Then a messenger comes on behalf of Arthur, delivering a letter of apology for Mom and an explanation that since Hugh is his cousin and still seen as a boy, he won't ask for a duel, and offers the excuse that Arthur, quote, could not have known who the lady was, end quote, as though that makes it more acceptable. Hugh's dad is very upset with him about the whole thing because Hugh was not practicing non-resistance. Mom says that, quote, I have faith that thou, even thou, John, wouldst have done as my boy did, end quote, which Dad finds infuriating. Hugh retorts that, quote, could I see my mother treated like a street wench or a gutter drab and lift no hand? I wish I had killed him. See, wife, said my father, yes, even this was to be borne, end quote. Ew. This whole incident is, for whatever reason, Hugh's turning point. He re-befriends Jack and never drinks or gambles excessively again. I don't know why, because from how he described himself, this just sounds like any other Tuesday. But for whatever reason, I guess this is rock bottom. Shortly thereafter, Dad makes him go to an unusually crowded Quaker meeting, which are a sort of combination religious service / community discussion space. The men all have to keep their hats on after coming inside, at least for, quote, long enough to satisfy custom by this protest against the ways of other men, end quote. This is apparently a Quaker thing. People were supposed to remove their hats in the presence of people of higher class or status as a sign of respect, but the Quakers refused because all men are equal under the divine rule of God, and this got a fair few Quakers in trouble, so it became a sort of cultural symbol of defiance. All men are equal, except for these slaves, of course, and also everyone listen to the king. Sure. Also, I feel like you take your hat off when you come inside in the same way you remove your coat. It's not about respect, it's about the roof is your hat now. There are no elements to protect yourself from inside, but this is symbolic, I guess, okay. So at the meeting, they all sit in total silence for 20 straight minutes, also a religious thing, and then one man stands and makes a speech. Quote, the days are darkening, the times are evil. Our master, set over us by God, has seen fit to tax certain commodities, and now we are bid by men not of our society, ungodly, self-seekers, sons of darkness, to unite with them in the way of resistance to the law. Let there be among friends neither fear nor any shortcoming. Let us cut down and utterly cast forth those who depart from righteousness. Are they not of the scum which riseth on the boiling pot? Then another man stands. He doesn't want to be cut down and cast forth. This community is his home. It's where he belongs, but he has to speak his mind. For starters, he thinks that restrictions have become way more severe lately, that people are being judgmental and hypocritical since when laws went against their beliefs, they have been perfectly happy to resist authority in the past. Quote, if grave old men like you, afraid of this mere shadow of passive resistance, if you are wholly with our oppressors, then, dear friends, it will not be the shadow but the substance of resistance that will fall in blood and ruin on you and on all men. There is blood on the garments of many a man who sits fearfully at home and thinks that because he does nothing, he will be free of guilt when the great account is called. Do not resist him who would slay a child or wrong a woman. That is how you read the law of God. It is extremes which bring ruin to the best Christian societies, and if the mass of men were with you, then civil order would cease. So these are the two conflicting Quaker attitudes splintering this community, and the stricter Hugh's dad side is starting to shun and expel the more rebellious side, which Hugh is starting to fall in with. Over the summer, Hugh is reunited with a girl he once went to school with, named Dorothea. She's the one who got whipped for crying because she felt bad for him as a kid. He and Arthur both talk to her at a party at Aunt Gaynor's summer house, and though she's very striking, Hugh notes in text that she was not beautiful, just graceful, with, quote, that charm of mystery and a, quote, strange flavor of feminine attractiveness, end quote. And now Hugh is feeling, quote, for the first time in my life, the mysterious influence of woman, end quote. He's not alone in his infatuation, though. Arthur is also quite taken with her, and spends the rest of the summer very blatantly pursuing her, which, she is 17. If it's improper for 30-something Arthur to duel Hugh because he's still a boy at 20, why is it okay for him to pursue 17-year-old girls? At the close of summer, Hugh's parents set off for Europe on a trading venture, and in their absence, he drifts even further from the Quaker ways, starting to dress fancier and take fencing lessons with Jack, which they do pretty well at. Jack is also very into Dorothea, but Arthur has her pretty thoroughly wooed, because he's spinning a lot of grand tales about his beautiful family estate in Wales that will surely be passed to him when his father dies, because his elder brother is very sickly. This story is directly counter to what he's been telling Hugh and his family, that the estate is in complete shambles, which makes Hugh and his aunt raise some eyebrows, but for now they don't question him. Then Hugh gets a letter from his father containing the news that his mother is dead. Quote, it is well that we should not let bereavement so overcome us as to make us neglect to be fervent in the business of life, or to cease to praise him who has seen fit to take away from us that which it may be we worshipped as an idol, end quote, which is exactly the sort of comforting words you want from your father under these circumstances. Dorothea offers Hugh condolences about his mother, which he's very touched by, and then he confesses that he loves her, to which she says, basically, please stop. He insists that she shouldn't marry Arthur, but he doesn't want to specify why, because he doesn't have proof that Arthur is lying about the estate, so this doesn't really accomplish anything besides annoying her. The first genuine battle happens over in Lexington, and some serious political rifts are starting to form in Aunt Gaynor's high society social group. She, like Hugh, is team screw the crown, go revolution. Dorothea is actually a, quote, red-hot Tory, end quote, and some heated words are exchanged between several people during one of her parties, and Hugh talks his way into a duel with an officer of His Majesty. The mere thought of this duel causes Dorothea to faint, to which Aunt Gaynor says, quote, I do believe she is in love with all the men, end quote, and calls her a shameless monkey. Jack comes along to the duel as Hugh's friend, or second, and actually ends up dueling the officer's second, and then gets himself stabbed in the neck because he was too busy worrying about Hugh to pay attention to his own fight. Hugh wins. Oh, get it? Hugh wins. His last name is Wynne. Hugh wins this fight, and Jack is alive. He just doesn't have all of his blood anymore. On hearing about this duel, Hugh's father tells him, quote, it is well that thy mother is dead before she saw thee come to this ruin of soul and body. "My God, father, how canst thou hurt me thus? I am in sorrow for Jack, and want help. To whom should I go but thee? Oh, mother, mother," end quote. And then Hugh starts sobbing uncontrollably, and his dad's only response is essentially, "We can talk when you stop sinning. Your very existence shames me." Father of the Year. Jack takes a while to recover, mostly lounging in a hammock at Aunt Gaynor's, but as he gets better, he and Hugh make plans to join up with the rebel army. But then Hugh is held back for months by dad stuff, his aunt getting sick, and eventually Jack just joins up without him, somehow going straight in with command over other people. Quote, "A pretty fellow am I to order other men about," end quote. This is just some young dude who missed the summer drills and training because he was injured. Who determined that he's qualified for command? Is it just because he associates with the gentry? That's probably why. It's also in this excerpt from Jack that I was introduced to my new favorite insult when Aunt Gaynor calls Jack's father a decrepit weathercock, which I was not ready to read. A weathercock is a weather vane, particularly a rooster-shaped one, so the most generic one you've probably seen, and it can apparently be used as an insult to mean fickle, changeable, inconsistent. Decrepit weathercock is so fun to say for no reason. It's taking everything I have not to put it on a t-shirt. I did cave and make it my Twitter header, though, so it better not have any bad connotations I don't know about. So Jack is off fighting and getting wounded in the Battle of Fort Washington. It all sounds very exciting, but all takes place off screen while we stay with Hugh, sitting around doing clerk work for his dad, because for some reason Jack isn't the main character, despite being better in every way. Like a year passes this way until British troops come and shack up in Hugh's hometown, including beloved cousin Arthur, who is invited to stay with Hugh's father, while Aunt Gaynor is forced to house a gaggle of officers. Hugh is getting really worried about his father. His memory is starting to fail him, and he's declining, and that's a big reason why he's been held up this long. But now that both of his homes are brimming with enemies that are super unpleasant to live with, he decides it's finally time to join the war. His aunt gives him £800 to donate to the cause, which, if you remember our wonky how much was a pound worth calculations from earlier, surely this boy is not carrying over 100,000 modern pounds worth of buying power in his pocket. He has to concoct quite a scheme to sneak out of the city and then gets immediately kidnapped. And then 2 minutes later, his kidnappers are attacked, and one of them is borderline beheaded while he and Hugh are tied together on the same horse. This kind of escalated quickly. Thankfully, they were being attacked by a group of rebels who agree to take an incredibly blood-soaked Hugh back to their army camp, and they present him to General George Washington, who another character describes as a, quote, reserved, tranquil man with a chained-up devil inside of him. Could lay a whip over a black fellow's back if a horse were ill-groomed, end quote. Great. Glad he's in charge. Hugh and his donation are both quite welcome, and he and Jack are joyously reunited. Quote, I think I should have kissed him but for the staring soldiers. In all my life I never was so glad, end quote. Man, you saw him like 2 weeks ago. This isn't even their first reunion since Jack went to war. He just stopped by and had dinner when Washington's army passed by Philadelphia. Also, this feels like an okay time to have the discussion that all of these books are using the word kiss very interchangeably and never specify the where or the how. You kiss your family, your friends, your romantic interest, and it's all described exactly the same way. A peck on the cheek and a smooch on the mouth are indistinguishable, and I don't know what the various social connotations of kissing were in this time period, so I'm trying to just roll with it, but it gets a little weird and or funny how open to interpretation these various kisses sound. The weirdest so far was actually back in Captain Horn, which you don't need to know anything about to understand this. There was a wedding, it was in unusual circumstances, so the wedded couple specifically don't kiss during the ceremony. And then later, the bride's 15-year-old brother, quote, threw his arms around her neck and kissed her, without, however, saying a word about that sort of thing having been omitted in the ceremony of the afternoon, end quote. These kisses should at the very least not be the same sort of thing there, buddy. That is your sister, and you are a whole-ass teenager. It all just sounds a bit weird, and I think that's fun. So, Hugh thinks about kissing Jack, moving on. He got to the army just in time because a battle happens almost immediately after the rebels march back to the city he just spent all that effort sneaking out of for the Battle of Germantown. It's a confusing, messy sort of fight shrouded in heavy fog, which is thick enough that some rebels accidentally end up firing on other rebels. And Hugh, I think, gets shot in the leg, but it's not definitively stated. He gets something in the leg. He passes out, comes back, fades out again, eventually gets loaded into a wagon full of other wounded men for a miserable, rain-soaked ride, during which he tries and fails to share scraps of rainwater off a soaked handkerchief with the man beside him, only to discover that the man has died along the way. He spends the night in a room full of groaning, agonized, occasionally screaming soldiers, and is eventually transferred into a prison building in town, because the rebels did not win that battle, so he has been captured by the enemy. Hugh is put with 15 other men in a 22-square-foot room. That is less than if it were 5 by 5 feet. 5 feet is about 1.5 meters. This is smaller than the average U.S. bathroom, and there are 15 guys in it. They are fed mostly bread and water. They do get some yard time, at least. Hugh tries to get several people to let his aunt know what's happened to him, but none of them do. For a month, his injuries are seen to by a half-drunk surgeon. Then, quote, the leg wound got full of maggots when it was no longer cared for, and only when in January I pulled out a bit of bone did it heal, end quote. You need your bones, sir. That doesn't sound correct. This book was written by a doctor. Is pulling out your bone shards proper medical treatment? Also, due to an explosion in the harbor, most of their glass windows have shattered, so through winter the floor of the room is sometimes thick with snow. But don't worry, they get 1 blanket apiece, and once or twice a week they get to have firewood, which they use to cook the rats that they catch for food. I'm not mad, because this is the most interesting thing to happen to Hugh so far, but we took a hard left turn from the rich boy goofs off, gets drunk, and fights with his dad antics that made up the first half of this novel. Hugh also gets dysentery, and then once he recovers from that, typhus fever. And he only survives this because his one friend in the cell, a man named Delaney, takes very devoted care of him. When he recovers, Delaney tells him about a weird encounter that happened while Hugh was delirious with fever, and an officer came by the prison to inspect things. This officer was a little fixated on Hugh, and Delaney told him Hugh's name and insisted that they needed better treatment or Hugh was gonna die. But the officer said that he was already a lost cause and left. And when Delaney describes this officer, he sounds like a perfect match for one Arthur Wynne. Arthur had really turned against Hugh. They mostly pretended to be civil with each other, but Hugh refuses to stop hanging around with Dorothea as a friend, and Arthur has been getting very jealous, even though at this point Dorothea has now promised herself to him. But Hugh is pissed that Arthur would stoop this low. Quote, he was unwilling to risk any worldly advantages by giving me a gentleman's satisfaction, and could coldly let me die far from the love of those dear to me. How impossible it must ever be for me to hate a man enough to do as Arthur had done. End quote. By February, only 5 of the original 16 prisoners in this room are still alive. At least this puts the blanket-to-man ratio at 3-2, and they could each have 4.4 square feet to themselves if they didn't need to huddle for warmth. Hugh finally manages to bribe someone to send a message to his aunt, but it's Dorothea who ends up coming to the prison because his aunt thinks he's dead and is out of town mourning. They have an emotional reunion. Dorothea is, quote, now all tears, now flashing a smile in between, like the pretty lightning of this storm of gentle pity, end quote. She says Arthur's going to try to help him get parole, and he's very distressed because he does remember seeing someone in the prison who looked a little bit like Hugh, but he'd thought it surely couldn't have been. She gets him moved to a room by himself, and he has the opportunity to bathe, shave, and change into nicer clothes, all part of his grand escape plan. Since no one has ever seen him looking like a person, and not a mess of hair and dirt wrapped in a blanket, he pretends to be a visitor and just walks out the front door from yard time, almost undetected. He does get noticed at the last minute, but manages to sprint off into the night after knocking over a nun. He gets out of town and meets up with his aunt, who is very happy to see him alive, and he rests at her house for a while recovering before eventually heading back to rejoin the army. Sometime later, Washington asks Hugh if he would be willing to go on a spy mission back into town because he knows the area, although it might be dangerous because he's also known in the area. But we know that Hugh has no sense of self-preservation, so he agrees without second thought. No matter how many times he dramatically escapes Philadelphia, the plot will immediately send him back every time. Now, Hugh is many things, but professional spy is not one of them. He is on the job for less than 24 hours before accidentally washing off his entire disguise that he forgot he had on. They had tinted his skin with berry juice so he would look less like himself. But then on the first morning, he takes a nice bath. And then a couple days later, once he has all of the information he'd been sent for, instead of leaving, he sneaks into the garden of a mansion and climbs up on a bench to gawk at a party happening inside. Dorothea happens to be there, along with Arthur, and a man named Andre, who's a captain on the enemy side who Hugh has met and been somewhat friendly with in the past. Then the music stops, and all the partygoers swarm outside, apparently so fast that Hugh can't just run somehow, and Dorothea and her boys come directly to his bench and bump into him, at which point he is grabbed by Arthur, who shouts that there's a spy. Dorothea faints, almost too conveniently, which is enough of a distraction for Hugh to get away, and he runs back to his army. He notes that Andre could have tried harder to help catch him and seems to have chosen not to. The British troops leave Philadelphia, so the rebels establish themselves in town, and Hugh is promoted to captain and tasked with recruiting, as well as helping out General Arnold, who's put in charge of the city. In Hugh's absence, his declining father has been growing much closer to Arthur, and now sees him as the proper, better son that he should have had. Aunt Gaynor even tells Hugh about a conversation that she overheard between the two about the family estate. Apparently, sometime after Hugh's grandfather gave it up to his younger brother, Arthur's grandfather, that brother quietly sold it back to Hugh's grandpa for a very small sum, so that if he ever wanted to reclaim his estate, he would be free to do so. Hugh's dad even has the paperwork to prove it somewhere, and has promised to give this deed to Arthur, who wants it for, of course, purely honest reasons. The estate is in such disarray, it's so run down and worthless, they might have to sell parts of the land off, and how could they do that honestly if they don't get this ownership straightened out? Aunt Gaynor thinks that this deed would give Hugh a chance to claim the land, since it should have passed from his grandfather to his father, who is now in a weak enough mental state that Hugh would be justified in seizing his assets. Hugh finds this tempting from a not wanting to let Arthur have anything nice standpoint, but he doesn't really want the estate. He likes living in America and has no interest in being a European nobleman, but his aunt very much wants to pressure him into pursuing this and becoming a noble Wynne of Wincot, which is the name of the estate that I don't know how to pronounce. He does convince his dad to go see a doctor, who tells him that, quote, "My father was beginning to have some failure of the brain because of his arteries being older than the rest of him, which I did not quite comprehend," end quote. You know what, Hugh? Me neither. Earlier, like 2 months into Jack's recovery from being stabbed in the neck, he cried while hearing about a battle that had happened, and his doctor said that was normal because, quote, "He who had too little blood could be neither courageous nor able to contain his emotions," end quote. How much blood would he even still be missing 2 months in? Is that how any of this works? Later, Jack tells Hugh about another doctor that once told him, quote, "The liver was the mother of ghosts and presentiments," end quote. Basically, gut feelings come from the liver. All of these doctors sound super legit. Their knowledge is very sound. I'm so glad we're trusting them with our lives. Dad's memory decline escalates to the point that one afternoon he fully mistakes Hugh for Arthur, repeatedly, and refuses to be corrected, so Hugh plays along to keep him calm, and his dad presents him with that deed, signing the estate to his grandfather. Hugh presents this to his aunt, but they agree not to do anything with it before consulting a lawyer. Jack does exactly the same thing that Hugh did earlier. He confesses his love to Dorothea and begs her not to marry Arthur, and she reacts just as badly. Quote, "I wish you would all go away. I can't marry you all," end quote. And then, quote, "I have been a foolish girl. I have cried for toys and have gotten them, and now I don't care for them, but I have promised," end quote. So she's not even that into Arthur at this point, but feels obligated to keep her promise because she doesn't have an actual reason to call off the engagement. The general in town that Hugh has been working with turns out to be a traitorous bastard, conspiring with the enemy, and related to this whole scheme coming out, Major Andre, who was at the party with Arthur and Dorothea, has been captured by the rebels as a spy and sentenced to death. Hugh sees this as essentially what almost happened to him if he had been captured at that party, and he would have been if Andre hadn't pretty much just let him go. So he tries his best to return the favor and argue for Andre's life to be spared, using his sway over General Washington, but it doesn't work. He is killed, and Hugh has a lot of feelings about that. It goes on for a while. Time passes, war happens, Hugh is promoted into Washington's main entourage to translate French, since there are a lot of French allies around now, and this eventually leads him near the small town of York, later in its life to be known as Yorktown. Here, both armies spend several days straight lobbing cannonballs at each other from a distance, and one night Hugh and Jack sit together on a hill, watching the smoke blot out the stars and the moon, talking about the vastness of space and interstellar warfare. Quote, "It is only to the eye of man that there is calm and peace in the heavens. No shot of cannon can fly as these worlds fly, and comets whirl, and suns blaze, and if there is yonder, as with us, war and murder and ravage, none can say." End quote. Not long after, he and Jack find themselves in the dark, rainy trenches preparing for an attack. Jack is 100% convinced that he is definitely gonna die, like he is before every single battle, so he tries to say goodbye. Hugh calls him an idiot, and then the men are ordered to charge forward, and what follows is a mess of mud and blood, cannon fire, and grappling in a, quote, hurly-burly of redcoats, end quote. Most of the fighting is being done with bayonets and blades, not bullets, especially due to the wet weather. Hugh takes several injuries, people are dying left and right, and then through the smoke and rain, Hugh locks eyes with Arthur Wynne. They charge towards each other and lock swords, and though both are skilled, Hugh is winning, until he gets grabbed by a wounded enemy on the ground. Quote, "I fell squarely backward, my cousin lunging savagely as I dropped. I had been done for, had not Jack struck up his blade as I lay, calling out, 'Coward!' End quote. It only takes a moment for Jack to ram his own blade in practically to the hilt through Arthur's chest. And then Arthur says to them, 'You win. I'm sorry.' No, he doesn't. I need to stop. The rebels have won the battle, and as the wounded are tended to and enemies are taken prisoner, Arthur is found not dead, but badly injured, punctured through the right lung, but potentially able to recover. Hugh is very distressed. He regrets not just having killed Arthur himself, but Jack is grateful. Quote, "If my friend had killed him, would Dorothea ever have married Hugh?" End quote. And Hugh comes to this conclusion himself by morning. While the Battle of Yorktown sort of symbolically marks the end of the war overall, it isn't technically over yet, but Hugh never sees active warfare again. Arthur isn't well enough to be shipped across the Atlantic, so he also ends up back in Philadelphia. Hugh is now determined to finally deal with the whole "Arthur left me to die in prison and then lied about it" thing, so he goes to track down his one friend from prison who had helped nurse him back to health, Delaney. As luck would have it, Delaney is in town at this very moment, one of many soldiers who had been stationed in the south but are now migrating north. Aunt Gaynor has Delaney come over for a visit. Hugh is not invited, but Jack and Dorothea are, and Gaynor steers the conversation very innocently to the topic of he and Hugh's time in prison. He is led perfectly into talking about Arthur's inspection, and how he definitely knew who Hugh was, and definitely left him to die, not knowing that Arthur's fiancée is standing right beside him. Dorothea is overwhelmed and has Jack walk her home, and he tells her about all of the other shitty things Arthur has done, like borrowing money from Hugh's dementia-riddled father, and suggesting to that traitorous rebel general Hugh worked for that Hugh be used to smuggle an encoded treasonous letter that, if he had been caught with it, could have thoroughly ruined him, even if he had no idea what he was participating in. Dorothea is upset, though, at the way that this information was thrust onto her, calling Gaynor's method cruel, and she distances herself a bit from all of them going forward. Now, there's a random thing that's come up once before, and it doesn't matter, but I think it's neat. Apparently people, at least the gentry, tend to write dinner invitations on the back of playing cards, which I have questions about. Presumably you can never use that card again because it's specifically written on the back. So that card is now marked. Do they have a specific deck that they set aside as a ruined, incomplete one just to write invites on? Do you throw out the rest of the deck? If you play cards a lot, do you just end up with a bunch of spares? Somehow, I clearly don't do enough gambling. Hugh and Aunt Gaynor meet with a lawyer regarding that deed, and the lawyer concludes that since the transaction giving the estate back to Hugh's grandfather was essentially unacted upon for so long, it is pretty much void. They could take it to British court if they want, maybe if they find some more recent letters that reference the land as being in Hugh's branch of the family, but chances are slim it will amount to anything. Arthur comes in to hear this verdict, now recovered from his stabbing. Hugh describes him as, quote, as beautiful a piece of manhood as ever did the devil's work, end quote, and then spends a very lengthy paragraph describing his clothes in detail, and says, quote, I wish you to see him as I saw him, that in a measure you may comprehend why his mere personal charms were such as to attract and captivate women, end quote. I don't think it's just the women he's captivating right now, dude. Hugh tells Arthur he has no plans to pursue the estate, they still hate each other, everyone moves on. Except Aunt Gaynor. More time passes, it's now 1782, and in July Hugh's father dies. He gets a note of condolences from Dorothea, their first real contact since the Arthur reveal, and he escorts her on a ride to his aunt's and prods her once again, asking if she loves him. And she's annoyed, and says she's tempted to marry Jack just to shut him up, and then says yes, anyways, she does love him, and Hugh nearly falls off his horse. And now they're gonna be married, I guess. Then one night, Aunt Gaynor ambushes Hugh and Dorothea with some letters she's hoping might strengthen their claim on the estate. She hasn't actually even read them yet, and Hugh doesn't think they'd be recent enough to make a difference anyway. Dorothea is confused because she didn't even know about the deed situation. Hugh had been keeping that from her for now, and suddenly Gaynor is telling her that she's definitely going to become the Lady of Wincot. And at first Dorothea seems excited, but then she says, quote, you have taken this man's love from him. You could not take his estate, now could you, Hugh? End quote. Which, yeah, he still has no interest in it. He does call Dorothea dear child, which, dude, she's maybe like 4 years younger than you, and also your fiancé. That's gross. This all blows up into a fight between Gaynor and Dorothea. Dee throws the deed into the fire. Gaynor calls her name so nasty that Hugh won't repeat them, but then they cry and make up and pretend like nothing ever happened. Hugh and Dorothea talk alone about it later, and she asks if it was wrong to burn the deed, and he says yes, because it only could have given him the chance to prove that he wouldn't make a claim even if he could. He clarifies that he's not even a little bit angry, but she still starts sobbing and calling herself wicked, and Hugh's attitude in his thoughts about the whole thing just feel weird and unnecessary and kind of condescending towards Dorothea. They go get married, which, honestly, you knew had to happen from the beginning, because Hugh the narrator often references how this memoir will be read by his children, and if Dorothea wasn't the woman he ended up with, his children would be reading chapter after chapter of him pining after not their mother, which I would have found very funny, but that was unlikely. The end of the war is officially declared. Hugh gets to see Washington one last time. We get a reference to La Morte d'Arthur, which is only notable because this is 2 for 2 for books I've read that were written in the 1890s, set in the late 1700s that reference La Morte d'Arthur. I talked about that in Quaker Invisible. It's even more random here. Anyways, back with narrator Hugh in his older age, quote, the years have gone by, and for me and mine there is peace and love, and not a man in years may not think upon in joy, end quote. So let's start with a review of Hugh Wynne from the Bookman's October issue of 1897, written by James MacArthur. The reviewer starts with a personal confession that he had wanted nothing to do with Hugh Wynne because its reception had been so irritatingly, universally positive. But then he worried that another reviewer might feel too pressured to follow the opinions of everyone else, so he'd better review it himself. So he read it, quote, with fierce joy to look out for those false notes and discords which he was sure the critics had sworn in secret to cover, end quote. However, after reading, he admits his opinion that, quote, no finer and more highly executed presentation of the War of the Revolution has ever been focused in fiction. The only weak character in this book, to our thinking, is Captain Wynne, who's Arthur. Dr. Mitchell is not at home with villainy. We feel that less unsophisticated creatures than Hugh, Jack, or Dorothea even, would have suspected and found means of denouncing him long before they did. But he is a very plausible villain, and we can put up with him for the sake of the noble and gallant company among whom this wolf in sheep's clothing stalks. And as happens sometimes, the real hero is not he who tells the story. To us, it would be Jack Warder, Hugh Wynne's trusty and tender friend with the heart of a woman encased in the armor of a man. The girl boy of Aunt Wynne, the Captain Blushes of Darthea. Hugh Wynne will be the charmer for women, but find us the man whose heart will not beat quicker to the music of Jack's simple, noble life. As to that charming, delightful, most captivating of heroines, Darthea, who could resist her, and who will not bear away in his bosom some feeling of pain and pleasure that her presence has left behind?" End quote. And after more and more and more praise, the last half page of this review isn't even about Hugh Wynne. It's about The Virginians by William Thackeray, and how much better the reviewer thinks that Thackeray portrayed one specific historical moment. And, I just think that's a rude way to end your review, James. Especially an overwhelmingly positive review. This isn't about that book from, mind you, 40 years earlier. This is about Hugh Wynne. My opinions are not as enthusiastic as Mr. MacArthur's, but I would say I mostly liked it. It was fine. It was a lot more about Hugh's childhood and growing up and family dynamics and conflicts with Quakerism than I was expecting. Rather than being more specifically around wartime, I didn't know it was going to be the full story of his youth. And on one hand, his relationship with his dad is probably the most fleshed out and interesting thing in the book, and exploring a normal sort of life for a specific wealthy sort of person against a backdrop of revolutionary America has some interest to it. On the other hand, Hugh is bland as unbuttered toast, and that does not a story-carrying character make. Also, the estate drama was weird, because it's the plot that I'd say everything else always came back to. It drives Arthur, ties in with Dad, Aunt Gaynor, Darthea. We're introduced to it in the very beginning, and it drives the resolutions for multiple characters at the end. Even in the midst of war, we pause for interludes progressing that plot, and Hugh does not care about it at all. He doesn't want the estate. He doesn't want to move to Europe. Our main character is not even vaguely interested in the most consistent through-line plot. Our main character with a history of problematic hedonism. Mind you, this could have so easily tied into some sort of character arc. This estate is a symbol of his genetic predisposition to being an indulgent hothead. But his character flaws are a side quest he deals with overnight before the estate becomes relevant, and going forward it means nothing to him. That drama is simultaneously ever-present, yet haphazardly tacked on. The only characters I actively liked were Jack and Aunt Gaynor, and Hugh's mom, and his dad was an interesting, well-written asshole. I don't know how Darthea infatuated the reviewer just like she did every man in the entire book. I didn't find her notable in any way. She was fine. Her and Hugh occasionally had cute banter, they were fine, but Jack should have been the main character. I would have much preferred being with him in the war than watching Hugh fret about his aunt's health for months at home. And Jack is treated kind of terribly by the end of the story. He watches the woman he loves marry his best friend and is genuinely happy for them both because he is a good friend and a sweet person, but all we get to know about what happens later in his life is that he dies and leaves everything to one of Hugh's children, so seemingly no family of his own. And maybe he was happy with that, but it would have been nice to know something about what became of the part-time co-narrator of this story. To be fair, he's also treated badly just throughout the book in general. He's concerned about Hugh's gambling addiction. Why, he's fretting like a woman. They have a solid friendship. Quote, "It is not like a man friendship. It is the way we weak girls care for one another." End quote. And then in the next sentence, he is called, and I quote, "a pet girl boy." Anyway, if you want to find out why Alexander Hamilton handed Hugh a letter addressed to, all caps, "My Dear Pussy," you can go check out this podcast's Instagram and Twitter, both at YOBPOD, YOBBPOD. I hope you have a wonderful day, and as a piece of life advice from the past, it is super easy to become besties with a bunch of the most prominent, history-defining people around. All you have to do is be born into a rich family.